friends, family, fellow travelers. If you are watching this, I'm probably already dead. Just kidding. Or am I? But seriously, I love that trope, don't you? I've seen it in several movies and television shows. I've read it in several books and laughed myself silly when it's been mercilessly mocked in comedy sketches. It's called the dead man writing trope, where a character starts off a pre-recorded or pre-written message with that kind of opening, and then says whatever important things they want to say to those they've presumably left behind. These recordings might include their intentions for how their estate should be distributed, or to bid a final farewell to their loved ones, or perhaps to offer clues to the identity of their killer with a demand for vengeance. Sometimes it's actually an elaborate ruse to try to get revenge on someone by framing them for a murder they didn't commit. Why, sometimes the person who recorded the message planned for it to be revealed after they faked their own death. Good times. But this isn't that, and my intention is to post this while I'm still alive, even though, ironically enough, a recent antigen test indicates I have COVID-19 even as I record this. I certainly didn't see that coming when I started working on this video. Rather, my goal right now is to start a conversation. Welcome to the INRIS Files, presenting thoughts on culture, history, and the human condition from a very specific Generation X point of view. This is a video message about these video messages. I want to tell you what I want to tell you, but that's going to require me to lay out a couple of stories first. Do you trust me? I'm going to try to make this interesting. When I was in college, I found my way to a commercial radio station that was actually owned and operated by students at my university. It was a training station where newcomers like myself could go through a program that taught us the skills necessary to prepare for broadcasting as a disc jockey, a newscaster, or a sportscaster. If you managed to do well enough, you could eventually train in commercial production or booking and hosting specialty shows. There were formal training programs with a structured curriculum, skills tests, secondary studios that were identical to the on-the-air studios and fully operational, where we could practice before we ever stood before a live microphone or mixing board that was being broadcast over the air. I originally trained in news. I learned how to cover an event, prepare a fact sheet, write copy from fact sheets, pull copy from the AP Newswire, and assemble these pieces into a coherent news break. I had to pass a test where I was asked to identify the city's mayor and its alderpersons, the county executive and its board of representatives, our state and federal legislative representatives, and so much more. I was assigned a big sib who was a well-established member of the staff, and I would go with them to cover a city council meeting and a county board meeting. I would practice mock newscasts with disc jockey trainees who were themselves practicing how to engineer their show from playing music to a news break. And then the day came when I was finally deemed ready for my first live on-air broadcast. Understand that I'd performed in front of an audience before all this. In high school, I'd competed in public trainings, tournaments, and done well. Those were held in school auditoriums that were filled with students of the hosting school, as well as a panel of judges. I was on the debate team, eventually earning the role of captain of our squad, and we always contended for, and sometimes won, the top spot among the high schools in our district. Those competitions were held in school libraries with smaller numbers in attendance, but you better believe you could tell when you landed a point or when you were losing their interest. There's a kind of instant feedback you get when you perform in front of a live audience, no matter how big or small. You can hear it. You can feel it. There is nothing as amazing as when you fully connect and win the audience to your side. There's also nothing so terrifying as when you lose your audience, when you alienate them or worse, bore them. Radio. That was something completely different. The newscaster stands alone in their booth with sound baffling on the walls that pull any possibility of echo or reverberation out of the air. It's a kind of quiet that is unnerving when you first experience it. There's a microphone with a button to press to cut the feed for the unavoidable cough or sneeze or burp, and another to talk with the DJ through the Q channel in both their headset and yours. There's the large plexiglass window that looks into the DJ's studio so that the DJ can signal to you with hand gestures that your mic is about to go live in 3, 2, 1. To wrap it up, to keep talking. And likewise, the newscaster can gesture to the DJ when to play the next soundbite, or to stop trying to distract you with their antics. But that's it. The news booth is very spare, and that first on-air experience was unlike anything I'd done before. I started off just fine. I read the script with our standard intro after the NBC News national feed. WVBR news time is 11:03. I'm INRIS Washington. And then I started to read my copy. The standard newscast during the late evening shift was something like 2.5 minutes of news. That would be 4 or 5 stories, if I recall correctly, averaging 3 to 4 sentences each. And then you'd throw to the pre-recorded weather report and then the sportscaster. Everything was going swimmingly. No audience to gauge and a DJ who was also still getting the hang of things, so I just read my copy. Things were going so well, in fact, that I decided to tempt fate by thinking about the audience. Somewhere out there, late in this spring evening, were possibly dozens of people with the radio playing, hearing my voice. Hearing these words I was saying right now, yeah. I was deliberately trying to psych myself out, and as soon as I started to feel that sense of nervous panic, what if I flop? I just pulled it back and focused on reading the words I'd typed up in all caps in front of me. I cued the card of the weather guy, I introduced the sportscaster, I read the standard closing tagline, and then threw to the DJ, and I was done. I think I'd been on the air several times before someone clued me into the fact that even at that late hour, we probably had thousands of listeners. Our signal reached beyond our location on the southern tip of the Finger Lakes region, all the way to the outskirts of Syracuse, New York, to the north, and Binghamton to the south. Elmira could pick us up just fine, and we were crystal clear in Cortland. Drivers traversing the state on Interstate 90 could usually pick us up for at least 20 or 30 minutes along their drive. And for that matter, the city of Ithaca had a population of over 28,000 people, and more than a few of them were college kids playing us in the background while they studied late into the night, or janitorial staff, tuning in to make their solitary work a little more pleasant. By the time I learned this, I was already comfortable in that booth. And this may sound weird to anybody who has never experienced it, but I was already connecting with that unseen audience. It's hard to convey how that connection develops, but it surely does. The feedback from the audience takes a little longer to receive. It's quieter and it's delayed, but it is absolutely there. There's the occasional phone call, possibly during your shift, but also possibly during someone else's shift, when the caller is asking about something they'd heard earlier. Something specific that eventually ties back directly to you. And word gets back to you. There's the occasional letter. There's the time you fill up your car's gas tank at the downtown service station a year or two after you've left the airwaves. And when you hand your cash to the woman behind the counter and you make some casual comment, she gasps and her face lights up with recognition, and she calls you by name and says she loves to listen to your show. I eventually did more than just news, but you get the idea. It took a while. It took years, in fact. But I eventually realized that I was in a conversation with the listeners. We had a dialogue. It was completely unlike anything you experience in a real-time conversation, and yet that rapport is just as real. It's a rapport that is based upon familiarity, imagination, and trust. Even when the broadcast seems at first to be one way, you learn to listen for the response. It can be subtle, but with those 3 ingredients, you can eventually hear it. As I record these messages here and post them on YouTube, it's a different venue from radio. The feedback can come more directly via the comments section. There can be emails or donations or metrics, and so many other ways. But again, with familiarity, imagination, and trust, I know I'm going to be able to hear you, even if you don't post comments, even if you're several generations down the road or long since gone several generations ago. Wait, what? I want this connection with you. I want to build this connection with you, and I want you to connect with me. Because here's another thing that's also been on my mind. When I was much younger, and all of my grandparents were still alive, it came to pass that my maternal grandfather started actively digging into our family tree. Well, his family tree. He was a direct descendant of a family that had originally owned the land that became part of the town of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. The family had leased this land to a group of settlers with a 99-year lease, or so the story goes, But then the generations that followed either failed to reclaim the land after the lease expired or the town refused to give it back. But either way, for a period of time back in the 1970s or 80s, members of this family decided to try to pursue some kind of settlement. And as they did the work to determine just who constituted this family, it turned out my maternal grandfather was one of the descendants, which of course means I was too. Now, I don't know how much, if any, of that story has any truth to it. And if there ever was any kind of settlement, I never learned anything about it. But it raised a number of questions about just who was who in my family tree. I knew that on my mother's side of the family, we were direct descendants of the Hatfields, a family whose claim to fame was being a part of one of the most notorious blood feuds in American history, the Hatfields and McCoys. Why, the very dining room table I'm sitting at right now was purchased by my great-grandparents, and it most certainly saw more than a couple of family dinners with people seated in these very chairs who lived through the events of that storied feud. On my father's side, we had family who fled the famine of Black 47 in Ireland, and a brick mason who fled poverty in Canada to find work in the U.S. during the First World War. But events of today have made me even more curious about my forebears. I live in the United States, where the population is becoming more divided than it has been in living memory, and it makes me wonder, both the Hatfields and the McCoys had family fighting on both sides of the American Civil War, but which side did my forebears fight on? In the conflict that divided Ireland, which side did my forebears come from? As I started researching these questions by tracing my family tree using popular genealogy tools available to us in this modern age of information, I looked at birth certificates and death certificates and census records, and why was my great-great-grandmother listed as a widow while my great-great-grandfather was listed in the same census 2 towns over as a divorcee? I eventually found a record of their divorce, and my great-great-grandfather died a couple of decades later, but my great-great-grandmother apparently stuck to the story that she was a widow. Fascinating stuff. And it makes me want to know. I grew up learning to sing and play musical instruments, as did my mother before me and her father before her. In fact, my grandfather was a music major in college and had at one point aspired to be a professional trumpet player, if I recall correctly. I know the kinds of music my parents liked and what kinds of music my grandparents liked, but what about my great-greats and beyond? Did they play any instruments? Did they sing? What did they do for fun? How educated were they, and how were they educated? Were they kind-hearted or fire and brimstone? What were their doubts and fears, and how did they deal with them? And while I'd love to step into a time machine and go back to talk to my forebears, there's also the question of what they were like at different points in their lives. I'm certainly not the same person I was 10, 20, or 30 years ago. But what if I could chat now with my father from back when he was the age I am now, or when he was just starting a family? What was my father like as a child? And the same goes for my grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on. What advice would my paternal grandfather have for me in dealing with my current dilemmas? And how would the advice from my grandfather when he was in his 60s compare with my grandfather's advice from when he was in his 40s or 30s or younger? By piecing together the documents and family lore, I'm learning to tease out the stories that lay beneath, and those questions become more and more fascinating, but also pursuable. And so here I am, learning to engage with those who have come before me, and it occurs to me that I'd also like to engage with those who are coming along after me. I would like for my kids in the future, when they're grown-ups themselves, to have a chance to get to know the teenage me, the 30-something me. But for now, let's start with the me at this moment. What questions do you have for me, kids, grandkids, generations far down the line? What observations would you be interested in from my vantage point in this very specific time in the history of our family, our community, our country, and our planet? This brings me to the third and final thing I wanted to talk about today, synthesizing. I'm recording this as a specific person of a specific age with a particular background at a particular moment in time. As a polymath, I've learned a lot of skills, and as an avid consumer of pop culture, I've read a lot of books, watched a lot of movies and shows, and listened to a lot of music. Take the breadth and depth of the themes and ideas, the presentation and the content of all these things, and what do they say about how my generation in middle-class North America during the late 20th and early 21st centuries were shaped by the pop culture we grew up with, and in turn shaped the culture we contributed to? And where, in these novels and short stories and how-to books and record albums and TV shows and movies and plays and fads and fashions, where in those specific expressions are the universal truths? This is why culture matters, and this is why taking it all together and synthesizing it is so important. The better we understand human nature, the better we understand ourselves, and the better equipped we are to face the challenges that confront us. And that is the INRIS Files. What do you wish you'd known about your ancestors? What do you wish future generations to know about you? Please share your stories in the comments section below, and please be kind when you engage in the conversation. Be sure to click like if you want to see more videos like this, and subscribe if you'd like to be alerted about them when I post. Thank you for checking out the INRIS Files, and we'll see you next time. And yes, by the way, this throat, courtesy of COVID-19.